ready, Gene?
I just wanted you to honor Mother.
I'm not going to go there with you. Okay, our speaker tonight is Dr. Carl Constein, a native of Fleetwood. He lives now outside of Reading, and graduate of Kutztown State Teachers College in 1942, inducted into military service, became an aviation cadet. 1944 received his pilot's wings, commissioned as second lieutenant, and he went to CBI, China Burma Indian Theater, and flew a C-46 Curtiss Commando over the Hump. And he's here to tell us what it was like flying. Carl, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bill. Good evening, everybody. Ken Burns said that there were 16 million Americans in uniform. That's a bit up from what I used to read, but I trust Ken Burns. 16 million, whatever, a lot. Most of them, of course, stateside, most of them in support roles. Even those who were in theaters were mostly in support roles. But everybody has his own story to tell. There are some vets out there, I think, of World War II. They all have stories to tell. And I'll tell you mine, but I don't think my personal odyssey is enough. I think I need to put it in the context of the theater of operations I was in, and then in a larger context of World War II. Did the CBI hold up? How big was it? Did it do its job? I'll touch on those things. Okay, do you remember your first flight? Well, I remember mine. It was in Fleetwood. We were playing ball, all those kids, and saw a World War I biplane flying low over the town. Practically never saw an airplane. And obviously going to land somewhere, so we got on our bikes and pedaled out to George Schuler's farm, and there he was, his helmet, his scarf, leather jacket, and a sign, rides $1. So we pedaled back into town and begged for a dollar. A dollar, some of you know, was a lot. It bought a lot of admissions to the theater, I'll tell you, to the movies. But fortunately, my father was not home, and my mother gave me the dollar.
Where was it?
This was in, I was 12 years old, and I'll tell you how old some of us types are who are still around in this living history phenomenon. This was only 29 years after Orville Wright flew his first flight, which was 12 seconds long, flew 120 feet. Only 29 years after that, I had my first flight. Anyway, I do remember the flight over Fleetwood. I thought it was beautiful. It was like a Christmas village. I saw my own home, and I saw the church, of course, and the hotel and the cemetery and everything. And since then, whenever I flew as a civilian, I insisted on a window seat, because the earth is varied and beautiful in all its variety. And so I've seen some wonderful things, as you have, and I can't quite understand the businessman, or maybe I can him because he's seen it so often, maybe. But the regular traveler who doesn't want to sit at a window and look up. At any rate, so then I enrolled at Kutztown State Teachers College. And after the first semester, I was able to earn every bit of the cost myself by working at the A&P store in Fleetwood, after school, after classes, and on Saturdays, and in the summer mowing just about half the lawns of Fleetwood, I thought. So then I graduated in 42, and of course there were no jobs in teaching. No one would employ a person who was eligible for the draft. So I worked in the defense industry in the original building belonging to the Fleetwood Auto Body Works. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Yes. You know the Fleetwood Cadillac? I bought one just before they stopped making them. It's a 1990, and have a couple of years to go before it's a classic, I think. Okay, then came December 7th, 41, and I graduated, went into making mattresses for the Navy. I was a cutter, and it was terribly boring. I could hardly stand it. And then I saw friends coming home from the service, some who'd gone through officers training, and they were all dressed in their uniforms, and I had to get out of that deal, and I had to, so I volunteered to move my draft number up, and I was drafted and inducted in Allentown on January 1st, good date to remember, 1943. Then I became an MP in Philadelphia, guarding coal piles of Philadelphia Electric at Gray's Ferry Avenue and in Norristown, 3 hours on and 3 hours off. I'm thinking to myself, I traded one boring job for another. What I wanted to do was go to OCS school. Remember OCS, Officers Candidate School? 90-day wonders, they called the graduates. That's what I wanted to do, but that was all closed. So what was open was to be on an air crew, either pilot, navigator, or bombardier. So I did. I went to Texas. First went to SAC, San Antonio Aviation Cadet Center, and was classified. Fortunately, I could have had my choice of pilot, navigator, or bombardier. Of course, I chose pilot, and of course, I hope to be a single-engine pilot. I think almost everyone does, but it's not your choice, of course. So I went to first, then after SAC, where we had wonderful training, physical training and class training, and I was in the best condition I have ever been in my life. It was sort of the West Point of the Air Force. Not Air Force, Air Corps. I was never in the Air Force. I wasn't even in the Army Air Force. I was in the Army Air Corps, AAC. So then I was sent for primary training to Uvalde. If any of you are into aviation, this was a Fairchild monoplane, P-19, wonderful little airplane. First thing we were taught, I was taught on that flight, is what happens when you stall an airplane. I bring that up because there was an accident in Buffalo last February. And when I heard the news, I tried to analyze it, and it seemed to me, I know there was icing, but my goodness, how often did Hump pilots go through all kinds of icing? So I concluded early that it was pilot error. It's a term you don't like to hear, and it's tough on families, but it was. This plane that they flew, and I don't know the designation of it, had a warning so that the pedestal actually shook when you were close to stalling. And the pilot, instead of pushing front to gain speed, pulled back, stalled out, and the co-pilot dropped the flaps. So it was too bad, and I'm not critical of them because they were apparently tired. One flew in from California to be co-pilot that day, and they were not well trained. They didn't have enough hours, and there is some correction being done now in the Aeronautics Administration to take care of that. Okay, I soloed in 5 hours, which was normal. Sounds like a little, but in those days it was normal. Then went on to Waco and had training in basic training on the Vault T vibrator. If any of you fellows get to World War II weekend in Reading, I hope you do. You hear a lot of them. They are noisy son-of-a-guns. And then on, at the end of basic training, it's decided whether you're going to be a multi-engine or a single engine. And most people prefer a single engine, Top Gun. But you have no control over that, and I was selected for a multi-engine. So then I graduated on August 4. These dates don't necessarily mean anything to you, but I'll give you a sense of the time here. August 4, 1944. And what you don't want to hear is that you are going to be sent to Reno. Because if you're sent to Reno, you are going to eventually fly the Hump. Life magazine had a big series on how dangerous the Hump was. Seemed almost more dangerous than flying in combat. And I don't think that's true. But nevertheless, everybody was a little bit leery of the Hump. We trained there in Reno on our C-46. Plane I flew was a Curtiss C-46. This is the China doll, so-called. 108-foot wingspan, 75 feet long, sit 22 feet high. Built originally by Curtiss, called the CW-20, but it never made it. It was competing with the DC-3, and the war came along, and of course salvaged that company. So we were sent to Reno and given about, 6 to 8 weeks training, not enough for anything. And when we got to the Hump, we had to fly co-pilot for 200 hours on the job training. So we were flown then to, after I came home, got married, went back, and were flown to Miami Beach, flown to India on the Crescent Run on the C-54 from the Azores, land in the middle of the night, and some island you can't even see. We weren't flying, we were deadheading. C-46, C-54 landed, and then my education began. Education is experience, really. So I learned a lot, and I learned a lot about culture and the ways, the mores of people. Went from Miami to Casablanca, the Azores to Casablanca, to Tripoli, and we had a night in each of these places. That's all, but still, you learn things. And Cairo, and then Abadan, Iran, and finally Karachi. Karachi's in the news right now because apparently it was the home of this would-be bomber in Times Square. It belonged to India then. It later became Pakistan, of course. I remember that I was there maybe 2 weeks, maybe longer, waiting for an assignment further east in India, where I would, from which base I'd be flying the Hump. And I remember it was 103 degrees every single day. Do you ever hear of the Hump? Most of it, good. I have this triptych display at World War II weekend. This year will be my 10th year. People look at it and say, the first airlift, the Hump, what do you mean? What's the Hump? Well, some person, we don't know who, of course, gave it that designation as the high point on our route. And that stuck, the Hump. About the CBI, familiar with that? China, Burma, India, theater. Okay. There were about 250,000 Americans stationed in the CBI. A drop in the bucket compared to 16 million, but a significant number. If you talk about how many troops there are today in any one place like Iraq or Afghanistan, a significant number, and yet nobody knows much about it at all. So I want to tell you a little bit about it. The main effort was to support the Hump. There was also, before that, of course, the Burma Road. And I have pictures on this triptych that you might want to look at. The circuitous serpentine road, the Burma Road, which of course the Japs bombed. One little bomb will close the whole road, naturally. So then General Arnold said to President Roosevelt, yes, we can have an airlift. First airlift, first concept. Started out very small in 1942. The first flight, the first flight to designate a route was a CNAC pilot on Pearl Harbor Day, by coincidence. CNAC, C-N-A-C, stands for China National Aviation Corporation. It's an amalgam, it was an amalgam of the Chinese government, the nationalist government, and Pan Am Airlines. And talking here about Memorial Day, I'm going to give a presentation at Newmanstown on Memorial Day. And this may interest you, this is different. I'm going to talk about a CNAC pilot. Wasn't in the Army, as I wasn't in the Air Corps, but flew for them as a mercenary. But we all flew the same routes, basically had the same planes, C-47s, C-87s, or mine, C-46s. And he was lost on the day of January 6, 1945. The worst day of weather flying the Air Force has ever flown in. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and maybe read a part from my book about that. The first flight carrying cargo took place on April 18, 1942, and it was to support Doolittle's raid on Tokyo. You remember reading about that? Yes. That was only 5 months after Pearl Harbor that somebody came up with the idea that for American morale, we had to show that we were really in this war. So there were, I believe, 16 B-25s that had to start early because somehow a Japanese plane spotted them. And therefore, it was a bit of a hassle for them, and many did not make it. But this first Hump flight was to supply gasoline to places in China where they could get their gasoline to fly back then. Incidentally, the Mid-Atlantic Air Museum, which sponsors World War II weekend and has a lot of planes, has a B-25, and 2 weeks ago, or whenever the anniversary of this was, April 18th, our B-25 was out there with 17 others to sort of mimic at least the takeoff of Doolittle's flight. Let me tell you the cargo. I was at a place called Chapua. Let me sit down here. Take a look after the meeting if you wish. I was based here in a place called Chapua, C-H-A-V-U-A. Insignificant town, but became a big base for our operation. I flew from Chapua over the northern tip of Burma, and Burma was held by the Japanese at the time, across the mountains to Kunming, China. Kunming is a big city, bigger now, important city in Yunnan province, where Mao Zedong got his start. At any rate, that was the route. My cargo, and the cargo of most of us at Chapua, was gasoline in 52-gallon drums, and 22 of them stashed in the hold of the 46, tied with a rope. Some pilots smoked. Yes, it sounds incredible when I say it. So my first order to any co-pilot when I became a pilot was no smoking. You can imagine those fumes and taking that risk. There were also clusters of 75 millimeter shells. There were all kinds of different things to be flown over there. The route was, as I showed you, across the Himalayas, starting on the first ridge, which was about 10,000 feet high, This is only 40 years after the Wright brothers. So the planes were not sophisticated, but it's amazing they were as good as they were. So it took us a half hour to get over the first ridge of 10,000 feet. Then we got to our assigned altitude, which in most cases was 18.5. The distance was 500 miles. The plane carried 1,200 gallons. So it could fly, excuse me. Its range was 1,200 miles. So we used the same gas from our tank to return, of course. The flight was 3 hours over, 4 hours back because of the prevailing westerly wind. And the navigation was crude. It was by Bendix ADF, Automatic Direction Finding. You had beacons, about 6 of them, and only 2 of them were really strong enough to be dependable. The one at Chapua and the one at Kunming. The others, they worked sometimes they didn't, and they weren't strong enough. But at any rate, you flew until you had on your instrument panel a dial which showed you which direction the beacon was, and you tuned into that radio frequency. And when the needle was straight up, you were headed toward station, toward the signal. When it did a flip-flop of 180, then you passed it. Basically, essentially that, and variations of that, was the navigation system. The 46 came in 1943, 30 of them delivered, and they had so many problems, came directly from the factory, I wasn't there, of course, at the time, that they were all sent back for changes and corrections. So it took 6 months to get those same 30 back. Why did they want the 46? Because it was bigger than the C-47. It had a big double door, it carried twice as much cargo, it flew higher, faster, and in all ways was a better airplane, although I must say I have about $100 in the 47. The rest of my time over there, 750 hours, was in a 46. And I must say it's a handful to fly. The hydraulic control for the ailerons and all controls came off the left engine. And if the left engine quit, you and the co-pilot struggled physically to keep that plane on course. So I came back then. But let me tell you about the enemy. There were apparently some Japanese Zeros harassing some planes, C-47s, that flew a more southerly route, sort of over Burma and that direction. And I can't get a handle in my reading on how many were downed. I estimate there were about 10, but I just don't know. There weren't many. Sometimes pilots and all veterans have a tendency to exaggerate. So I would say 10 is a reasonable number. So the enemy then there were 2 enemies. One was the terrain. If you had to bail out over Burma, Burma always looked to me like a vast sea of broccoli. And if you bailed out over Burma, you would undoubtedly be caught in a 100-foot tree. Try to work yourself down with a machete in your backpack and so forth. And some did. Some fellows, of course, who bailed out returned. They didn't all have great difficulties. Then if you bailed out over China, well, that was pretty well curtains too, because of the rugged terrain. And the instructions were to get to a river and go head south and look for natives. In Burma, the Kachins were okay, Panagas were headhunters. So those 2 enemies, but the weather was the biggest enemy. And the weather was of 2 kinds. We're getting into the spring now, so what's happening over there in India is that the monsoon is blowing in a lot of rain. The monsoon is not a rain, but a wind. So from spring until 6 months later, you have steady rains. You have stratus clouds. You don't have the cumulus or cumulonimbus building up. And it rains most of the time, maybe 100 inches a month, I read. So that's tough on maintenance, it's tough on taking off and landing and stuff and everything. But it isn't tough to fly in, although you have to fly on instruments. And very often, you would take off, 15 seconds later you'd be on instruments, and you really wouldn't see the ground again until 15 seconds before you landed at a field a mile high in China. But really, if you didn't have an engine failure or any particular problem, it was okay. Then the second half of the season starts in the fall and goes through the winter, and then you do have the cumulus clouds building up, thunderstorms building up to 40,000 feet. You can't get over them, you can't get around them, and you go through them. And you can't imagine seeing a thunderstorm here on the ground, the violence inside those thunderstorms. Every plane had dents on the side of the fuselage from ice that was flung off the propellers, de-icing the propellers. You did have equipment to eliminate the wing ice, call them boots, alternating boots on the wings, and that would do it. But then when they didn't work, and there weren't replacements, you had to fight that issue. Carburetor ice was a big problem because, of course, you had a carburetor heater, and the argument always was at officers' meetings, do you put the heat on before you go into the weather, or do you wait and break it off? Well, let me read a little bit, a few select chapters from my book. Not chapters, just little episodes. My first flight was a flight to nowhere. I'll just paraphrase this. It was the pilot's last flight. He had accumulated, at that time, was 500 hours is all they needed to go home. Tunner, the general, increased that to 650 and eventually to 750. So it was his last flight and my first flight. And the left engine started coughing when we were at altitude, and he said, "We're not going to take that. I'm not going to take this. We're going to take it back." So we did, and it worked out all right. The engine functioned well enough to land, and so it was a flight to nowhere. There's great beauty on the Hump. You read what I have in my book about that, and it took me about 3 flights to really see the Hump. This is what I say. Just after we crossed the first ridge, we broke into the clear over Burma. I gasped. Suddenly, marvelously overhead in the cloudless sky was the sun, a white-hot furnace spewing dazzling brilliance over the jagged peaks in the distance. Sheer, absolute beauty. Gray cliffs, some variegated in black, most topped by snow-capped peaks. A favorite psalm flashed into my mind. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. On tours to Europe and Africa since then, I've flown over marvelous sights and panoramas, but nothing compares to the Himalayas. I will never forget that first view of the Hump. And then one other part, which was the worst day that I told you, January 6, 1945. It was a strange day. It should have been a clear day except for thunderstorms and cumulus clouds, but it was different. It seemed almost to be a monsoon type day. And I describe it as a garbage can lid being over the whole field. The turbulence, now we're at altitude. Turbulence grew worse, tossing the C-46 about wildly. I thought back to my aborted first flight in November. I caught a glimpse of thick ice on the wings and hail like golf balls striking everywhere. Nothing we could do about the wing ice, the de-icer boots having been damaged and removed. But the prop de-icers were functioning, slinging huge clumps of ice against the fuselage. My eyes shot up and opened wide when I heard the first volley. The windshield too was icing up. The airspeed jumped from 80 to 260 and back down again as sharp gusts pushed us up, then down, then sideways. Lose the artificial horizon and we'd have no idea whether we were upside down or right side up. Okay, so I've written 3 books, and you're welcome to take a look at these. This is my experience. This one. There were a lot of Hump pilots in the country, and when they bought my book, some of them sent their own stories, and I accumulated 130 of them, and with their permission included them in this book called Tales of the Himalayas. Missing in the Himalayas is a story of a recovery by a JPAC team from Hawaii to recover a C-46 that was lost 60 years earlier.
Wow.
Lost the same day I had my first flight. And he was pushed up into the Himalayas, up into Tibet. I had a call from a fellow, Captain Kent in Hawaii, asking whether they were going to do this or team selected, and would I be interested in doing a book? And I said, well, tell me how I'm going to do that. And he said, well, he would copy me with every email he sent to his commander back in Hawaii. So I said yes, and I did it. It's a very military type book. So if you're interested in military type aviation, in the sense that what you go through to try to recover a plane and its crew, that's what this book is about. So people don't know much about the CBI. They would know more about it, except for the fact that the atom bomb obviated the need for the Hump at all. Who knew that at the time? Because one of the objects of the Hump was to have a base in eastern China from which to launch an attack on the homeland, on Japan. We talk about sometimes ordinary heroes. You know, there's a book going around, it's called Ordinary Heroes. I don't really understand that term. It's what would be called an oxymoron, because a hero is an extraordinary person. And certainly, as Tom Brokaw will tell you in his book, Greatest Generation, nobody talked about being a hero. Rather, you would have veterans say, well, we did what we had to do, that's it. There's no heroes. I knew only one hero personally, and his name is Frank Wenrick. He died a few years ago. Lived in Reading. He became a pilot at Reading Airport and on small planes. Went into the service. He was not a cadet, so he wasn't qualified as an Army pilot. But he flew little liaison L5 Piper Cubs, and he also was a mechanic. And Flip Cochran, the head of a group called the 1st Commando Group, had its own little Air Force, wanted to have a glider event called Operation Thursday. 57 gliders to fly behind the lines in Burma, where Merrill's Marauders were. And my friend Frank volunteered to do that. He had to be trained, and he did it. 57 planes, 57 gliders, waiting on runways to be picked up, to be snatched, flying at night. Weather got bad. Finally, the pilot radioed to Frank that, yes, we're ready for release. And you saw the smudge pots finding the make-believe, the makeup, the make-believe, not make-believe, but the temporary runway, and they landed. 57 and 17 didn't make it. Frank did make it, fortunately. The last thing I want to say is that they call this phenomenon living history because we're still living. We're going to live another couple of years, maybe. But then there won't be any more living history of World War II. There is, however, real history, and I'm a Pennsylvania German. Ich kann Deutsch schwätzen, vielleicht etwas, can someone here Deutsch schwätzen, verstehen? Well, when I joined Haynes Church, which was built in 1735, one of the first Reformed churches in America, I became very conscious of the history because the front part of the 1766 church is still there. We worship in the front. That's part of our edifice now. So I wrote a book, not about only that, but I wrote a book called From the Rhine to Penn's Woods, how it's a historical novel based, of course, on facts. How a family that I called Stout, S-T-A-U-D-T, came to America, to Philadelphia in 1753, branched off into what is now called the Tulpehocken district. And that goes up, some people say, as far as this, even farther. But it certainly goes as far as Lebanon, from the Schuylkill River on. I have some Pennsylvania German in here, if anybody's interested in that. I don't have many books here for sale, but I have cards if you're interested. So let's see if you have any questions that I can answer about World War II.
Anybody have questions?
Yes.
The big date that's fixing all of our minds. I don't know if you can help us, but I've read so many books on this subject. December the 7th, 1941. I've read books that spell it out. Roosevelt was warned 20 times about Pearl Harbor. Is that true or false?
Oh, I don't know.
No, did you ever? I want to know if you ever heard any scuttlebutt
No.
as far as that effect.
No, never did. Sorry, I can't help you with that.
Jack, in the back there.
Hey, I understand that you earned the Distinguished Flying Cross.
Yes.
Can you tell me the story behind that? The mission or missions that you earned that for?
Yeah, it's an automatic. First you get for, I think, 300 hours on the Hump. You got the air medal, and then for another 100 you got the cluster for that. And after you have 500 hours, then you get the DFC. Let me tell you how poor the morale was over there and how poor the management was. I got my DFC when I came back from a night flight. I was lying on my bed without any word from anybody, without anything with it describing it or why I got it. It was just there. So that was a puzzling way, I thought.
That's great.
But yeah, it's a medal that pilots, Army pilots, are proud to have. Yeah. Any? Yes.
How many flights did you make across now?
Yes, I made 96 round trips. That would be 192 crossings. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you or any of your fellow pilots have any regular communication or contact with the CNX house?
I think not. I certainly didn't. The C-Night pilots were based a little farther west in China, Dinjiang, and they had marvelous facilities, we understood. And they earned about, they didn't earn, but they received about 4 times more salary. This was a Muslim, many of them were British, except this fellow that I'm going to, from Lebanon, that I'm, or rather Nubistown, that I'm going to talk about. And I never met him, except we were flying that same day. And so I feel a closeness to him. But to answer your question, I don't know of anybody who ever did.
You didn't know any person?
I did not. No. Yes, or whoever.
When you landed in Abadan airfield, do you recall what your temperature might have been?
I don't recall the temperature. temperature, but I recall the wind. We had lunch right there at the field, and the wind blew all over the sandwich, and it was miserable. But it was hot. Yeah. Were you there?
Yes, the average daily temperature is around 140 degrees.
Oh. Well,
I was stationed in that area for 19 months,
oh, really?
and I experienced temperatures as much as 186 degrees. They often stand.
What was your assignment there?
I was in the battalion supply, of a port battalion,
Okay.
and we were one of the major supply lines for we got our mail from Afghan
I see. Yeah. Yes.
Very few Americans realize that one of the greatest college football coaches that ever took the field flew with the 8th Air Force over in England. His 25 missions were up, and they said, Major Landry, you're going home. He said, I'd like to stay. My crew has 9 more. And he stayed. B-17s now, and he made it. He wasn't shot down. He came back to the States, and he ended up at West Point, 1945, 46, 47. Colonel Earl Red Blake, Tom Landry, and Vince Lombardi.
Oh, yeah?
That was a hell of a staff. It was a hell of a coaching staff.
Do any of you recognize the name Eric Severide?
Yeah.
Okay. Eric Severide and some officials from the State Department and a few Chinese generals of high rank were on a mission to China from my base, Chapua. Now, of course, I wasn't there then, this was early. And they lost an engine, and they had to bail out and crash also. And Eric Severide took over. The crew was not capable of handling the situation, and it's amazing, the story. He wrote a book called Not Too Wild a Dream. I don't know if it's available anymore. But that was an interesting story because it made the news and, again, made all of us back home so scared of their sons and husbands who were over there. There was one in the back, yes. But way in the back, I think, was,
Yeah, this Joe.
yes.
Have you ever been to Warner Robins Air Force Base
Yes,
in Georgia?
yes.
They have a great exhibit there on the 14th Air Force, and then the Chinese. Well, what did they call them? Was it the Chinese Air Force or was it the Chinese American?
Flying Tiger.
No.
Flying Tigers
AVG,
were
American Volunteer Group.
No.
No, he's not thinking of that. He's thinking of the 14th Air Force.
Yeah.
Che, what's his name? Who?
Chiang Kai-shek.
Chanel. And most of the gas that I flew over went to them.
Well, when they go into the details, though, the Chinese military was massive, and that's really been, forgotten. And a lot of our guys trained them and supplied them with aircraft. But one of the things I think that's interesting about the CBI is your patch.
Yeah,
And there are so many variations of them.
yeah.
Did you have patches made up, or did you have your uniform made up? Because you had, particularly in Pakistan, India, you had those tailors right there, right?
Yes.
Did you do any of that?
No, we lived a rather sheltered life, I must tell you. Didn't get around much. There's no way to get around. And furthermore, they didn't want you to get around. I flew into China 96 times. Never was allowed to get off the base. Never.
What about in Pakistan and India?
In Calcutta, for example, in India, you would be able to find these things, yes. But I have patches. I'm not exactly sure where I got them.
This is a theater-made bullion patch that you have.
Okay, yeah.
No, but somehow the experience of World War II in India and Pakistan did not make them closer to us. Obviously, they wanted their independence from Great Britain, but did you use a lot of them as local laborers?
Oh, yes. In both ends, Indians, of course, and Chinese forces. Oh, sure.
And you said you got into Kunming.
Kunming, yeah.
What's that town today?
Kunming, It's a big city in southwest,
It's not like Peking, it's now Beijing.
southeast China. No, but I would imagine there must be 8 or 9 million people coming. Big base. Another interesting point, if I may. Of course, there was as you know, a war between Mao Zedong's Chinese communists and Chiang Kai-shek. And they agreed before the war started that they would set their differences aside because they had to survive as a nation. But then after the war was over, you know, Mao Zedong took over, you know that. Yes?
Okay, you flew the hump. As far as the Japanese, weren't there a lot of stories? Because the Japanese were barbaric. If you got shot down, forget it. I think Doolittle lost 3 or 4 men that were executed in Japan.
Well, yes, perhaps the best example of that is the Sino-Japanese War, where it's reported in a book that the Japanese would throw a baby
Yes.
from one to the other
Chinese baby.
and bayonet it. Now, yes, it is, I believe, factual that some of that was awfully rough.
Tell us something about the base in China. What was the purpose of the base? How large was it? What was it? Who manned it?
Now, there were other bases in addition to Kunming, but that's where almost everybody flew into. It was large, and it was the headquarters for Chennault's 14th Air Force. So the Americans manned it from the Air Force point of view. The purpose was to supply not only the 14th Air Force, but somebody mentioned the size of the Chinese Army. And of course, Brigadier Joe Stilwell's main role was to advise the Chinese Army. And it was massive, and they really tied up about a million Japanese troops. So that part of the hump was a success. But had we known there would have been an atomic bomb, the whole hump probably would not have been necessary. It was big, it was mile high, and pretty well run. Yes.
Americans talk about Bataan and Corregidor. At the end of the war, we had the people, the NCOs, the Japanese officers. We hung about 100 of them, executed them. The other 300 ended up being in Japanese government. That was our justice system. They got away. That's tragic. When I think of all the Filipinos and all the Americans that suffered
Yes.
in the Bataan and the Corregidor death camp.
Sorry? My discharge? I didn't hear the last part.
Well, what your career was after you were discharged?
Oh, yes. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was discharged at Indian Town Gap, and they gave us medals instead of promotions. So I came home a second lieutenant. I never got a promotion over there. Give us medals instead. So I finally got a promotion on my papers. So I was promoted. I was promoted to first lieutenant at my discharge. Okay, what I did after that was to teach English in high school, and then I went and got a master's degree at Temple and a doctorate at Temple, and kind of lost my way and became a school superintendent. That's about what I did. And I also wrote books. When I retired, I wrote a book a year for 9 years, and for 8 years I have my 9th in my mind, and I guess I'll get started on that one. Yes?
Do you still fly?
No, I don't. No. Yes?
Where were you superintendent of school?
2 places, Mount Penalorousis, which is called Antietam, and Wilson School District in Berks County. Mm-hmm.
Okay, if no other questions, we do have some refreshments back here. Bill? We will be.
I'd like to make a comment on our guest. I think with the quote here by American Chief of Staff General Albert C. Wiedemeyer, who was Shanghai Chef's American liaison. Flying the Hump was the foremost and by far the most dangerous, difficult, and historic achievement of the entire war. So
Yeah.
your job wasn't so easy.
Well, it wasn't easy, but there was nothing to be done about it, right? I mean, it required a little fortitude. You had to think about it day by day, and some nights when the big thunderstorms over the hump when you went to bed. But I would have to say that's, in my opinion, a bit exaggerated. But Tunner sank, in our opinion, when I talked about January 6, 1945. Well, Tunner and everybody knew that that was the worst day out there, and he would not close the hump, primarily because he wanted tonnage. Why? Well, for the 14th Air Force, but also for himself. We don't change when we get into the Army. We're the same people. Now, he later conducted Korean airlift and, of course, the Berlin airlift. They did a good job. But not many of us think too kindly of him because of that. Okay, thank you.
By the time you had your first flight, the war was over. You had 96 flights in a period of approximately about a year. You making about one mission every 3 to 4 days?
Yes. And we did not have our own planes as bombers or fighters do. We took whatever plane was there for logistics. And that was true of the crews, too. The pilot, I was co-pilot on January 6, 46, and he was a darn good pilot. And he consulted with me. We found out that we were being blown north. And we could hardly believe how far off course we were. We crabbed into the wind about 30 degrees. Now, if there are any pilots around, you know, you never make a correction that big. But we did, and we made it. So the point being that, 96 trips and, with mixed crews and airplanes that weren't maintained too well, that far from home. And sometimes I think about it and I think it wasn't me. There were just 3, pilot, co-pilot, and radio operator. We couldn't use a navigator. No armament, no. Yes. No, it was not. It was like driving a truck. Really, it was. It was scary. I had 2 single engines, which means the engine quit, and I had to land in those conditions. So that was exciting. And sometimes, the only thing I feared, when you talk about fear, was this, that when you get to Kunming, you would be stacked up because of the weather. And you would descend you were instructed by the tower. There was a 500-mile separation between you. And maybe there were 6 to 10 planes in the stack. Okay, if there was a plane above you that was having trouble, he could call a mayday, help me, French, mayday, and go right down through the stack. Now you think about that. That can scare you, but there's not too much point to thinking about it. Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
You noticed when we did the flag salute that I was shooting instead of my heart. That is now a new regulation that veterans are permitted to salute during the pledge of the flag.
Susan, do you have a piece of paper? Has she got? Oh, you got one. Okay. Hey, what's that? No, I still have. Last month I got some. I finally have one. They did. Take it in there. Take it in there. For sure.
Very interesting. Very interesting. You're going to be down in Newman's today?
Wait, this gentleman's going to pick him up.